Ever find yourself waiting for videos to load, wishing for, like, way faster internet?
Now tell me about it.
Well, we're about to dive into the kind of wild history of how we got those digital pipes we all rely on. Specifically, British Telecom's network.
Right. It's a story with more twists and turns than, your average tech explainer.
Okay, so we've got research papers, historical accounts, the works, way more than your usual deep dive.
And get this, the journey to a fully digital UK. It's not just about cables and wires. We're talking about the big dreams, the ambitions, the things that fueled a whole technological revolution,
All right, let's get into it. So fiber optic cables, everyone knows those are like the gold standard for speed, right?
Disagree, yeah.
But why isn't the entire UK wired up with that stuff, especially since they were actually developing it here back in the 1970s?
That's a good question. And people love to point fingers at Thatcher and the whole privatization of British Telecom in 1984.
Right, classic Thatcher, right?
But to really get it, we had to rewind further, back to the 1960s. British Telecom, back then, it wasn't even BT. It was part of the General Post Office. The government entity.
Wait, the post office?
Yeah.
Seriously? I can barely imagine them dealing with anything beyond stamps and, like, the occasional telegram.
I know, right? Sounds kind of funny now, but they were already thinking way ahead. They had this vision, this network that could handle everything.
Everything.
Voice calls, data, even video.
No way.
Way before the internet as we know it. They were deep into this idea of a fully integrated digital network.
Wow. What were they, psychic or something?
Well, cybernetics was a big deal back then.
Cybernetics.
Yeah, it was all about understanding how systems process information and control themselves, like from machines to, entire society.
So big picture stuff.
Yeah, isolated. The post office, they were taking cues from that world.
Okay, so they had these digital dreams, but what did that actually look like in practice?
Picture this. A robot telephone operator. Her name was Grace.
Grace.
A robot operator? Are you serious?
Yeah.
Totally serious. They were trying to automate long-distance calls.
Can you imagine the customer service complaints on that one? I just want to talk to a real person.
I know, right? It's kind of hilarious thinking about it now, but back then, it shows you just how optimistic they were about technology.
I guess every era has its blind spots.
Oh, for sure. But to be fair to them, they weren't completely naive. They knew there could be downsides. Like, think about telephone operators back then. That was a huge job, mostly for women.
Right, so automating that's a lot of jobs potentially lost.
Exactly. Job displacement, especially for women, it was a real concern.
And that's something we're still dealing with today, right? The whole fear of technology replacing jobs.
Without a doubt. But it's interesting, right? The post office back then, they couldn't just ignore this social impact. So they actually launched this whole friendly telephone service campaign.
Friendly telephone service, what was that all about?
Well, they knew that automated systems could feel impersonal, right? So it was all about countering that. The human operators who were left, they were encouraged to be more casual and chatty with customers.
So more human to balance out the robot revolution. That's kind of brilliant, actually.
Right.
Okay, but while they were busy with Grace, how were they actually transmitting those signals across the country? What was the tech behind it all?
Microwave towers, those huge structures like the BT Tower, the one in London.
Oh yeah, iconic.
Those weren't just for show. They were symbols of ambition, of technological progress.
Right, a very visible sign of progress.
They even explored this thing called waveguides.
Waveguides? What in the world are those?
Basically, imagine tubes. But these tubes, they transmitted high-frequency waves.
Sounds complicated. Was that actually a thing back then?
It didn't really take off for widespread use, but the fact they even tried it, that says something. They were determined to find ways to handle massive amounts of data, always pushing the limits.
They were serious about staying ahead of the curve, but then along came fiber optics, right?
Yeah, that was a game changer.
Totally. So did that completely change the game for them?
It did, but not in the way most people think.
Yeah.
See, optical fiber in the 1970s, it was a true revolution waiting to happen.
Okay, so this is where that whole story about Thatcher killing fiber, that's where it starts to unravel, right?
See, it's a way more nuanced than that.
So it's not as simple as Thatcher coming in and just like ripping out all the fiber plans.
Not quite. From what we've found, her government, they didn't outright reject fiber optics.
Okay, so what was their deal then?
Their approach was more about fostering competition, letting the market figure things out. They really liked this thing called the Integrated Services Digital Network, ISDN for short.
ISDN, right. I've heard of that.
The idea was to have this one network that could do it all. Voice, data, video, everything unified.
Sounds great in theory. Did it work out that way?
Well, ISDN was ambitious, for sure, but it also kind of backfired. See, they were trying to make it work with the older, slower tech that was still around.
Right, trying to please everyone.
Exactly. And in trying to do that, it actually slowed down the rollout of a truly high-speed network.
The irony, so a clash of visions, right? You've got the centralized infrastructure versus the whole market-driven approach.
Exactly.
Speaking of visions, the post office, they had this massive research center at Martlesham Heath, didn't they? What was the deal with that?
Oh, Martlesham Heath. That place is a whole other story. Imagine this. You've got this quiet, rural village in Suffolk.
Peaceful, idyllic.
Exactly. And then, bam! They plunked down a cutting-edge research center right in the middle of it.
Talk about a culture clash. Did they at least try to make it blend in, or?
They did, actually. And it's almost funny, in a very British way. They tried to create this kind of instant village right next to the research center.
An instant village.
Yeah, complete with traditional architecture and all that. They were hoping to make the transition a bit smoother, for both the researchers and the locals.
It's that classic British thing, isn't it? Always trying to balance the old with the new.
Totally. But anyway, as the post office turned into British Telecom, Martlesham Heath, it kind of mirrored that whole shift. Privatization,
Right.
market-driven innovation, all that.
So what happened? Did the research center change?
Big time. It went from being this hub for long-term, ambitious tech development to, it became a Dastral Park.
A Dastral Park.
It's Science Park now.
Yeah.
More focused on, the business side of research, commercial stuff.
So a bit less idealistic, a bit more practical.
You could say that.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. This shift, it wasn't just about technology changing, right? There were other forces at play. Other groups pushing BT in a particular direction.
You're talking about those invisible hands of the market, right? The movers and shakers.
Exactly.
Right.
And in this case, one of the biggest players was the city of London.
Ah, the financial district. I bet they weren't big fans of dial-up connections.
Not a chance. They needed speed, reliability, the whole shebang. And they were organized about it, too.
Yeah.
They had groups like the City Telecommunications Subcommittee, all dedicated to lobbying for better infrastructure.
So they were putting on the pressure.
Oh, yeah. They needed things like faster telex services, especially for stuff like the Bankers Automated Clearing Services, BACS, They handled all those automated payments between banks.
High-stakes stuff. So even before privatization, the city was already throwing its weight around, shaping things to fit their needs.
100%. And this is where it gets really interesting. The city's influence, it went beyond just, demanding better service. They had this whole vision, almost like an ideology, about how technology should shape society. You can almost call it a London ideology, kind of like a precursor to that whole Silicon Valley mindset we know today.
A London ideology. Now that's a new one on me. Break that down for me.
Okay, so imagine this. You believe that technology, especially communication tech, should be driven by the free market, right? Less government, more individual choice, that sort of thing. That was them.
Sounds familiar.
Exactly. And they saw tech as this tool for double liberation. Economic growth and personal freedom all rolled into one. Sound familiar?
Very Silicon Valley. So you're saying London got there first with that whole tech is liberation thing?
That's what it looks like. And this London ideology, it really influenced BT's decisions even before Thatcher officially privatized things in '84. Remember those long-range planning documents we talked about?
Yeah, they were full of surprises.
Right. They show how the post office was grappling with this whole new way of thinking about technology in the market, trying to balance their old vision with these new pressures.
So they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, this dream of a network for everyone, and on the other, the demands of this powerful financial sector.
And let's not forget the government itself. The political winds were changing too.
Right. Thatcher was all about privatization, letting the market sort things out.
Exactly. And that created this whole dilemma for the post office. How do you reconcile this grand vision of public service with these new pressures for, efficiency and profit?
And on top of that, you've got these broader anxieties about technology itself. Were they worried about things like privacy, job displacement, all that stuff that we still debate today?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't talk about this stuff without acknowledging those fears, right?
Right. So were those concerns actually on their radar, or were they so caught up in this technological whirlwind that they didn't really stop to think about the consequences?
They definitely thought about it and talked about it. Our research turned up all these internal memos, policy discussions, even warnings from engineers and researchers.
Warnings like, hey, this tech could backfire in a big way.
Pretty much. Some of them were really worried about, what happens when you automate everything? Does it dehumanize things? And then there was privacy, which was a whole other can of worms. They knew that a more connected world could also mean less privacy for everyone.
It's amazing how those early pioneers were already wrestling with these huge ethical questions we're still struggling with today. But did any of that actually change the way they did things?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? They definitely discussed it, no doubt about that. And it did shape some of their policies, at least on paper.
Really?
But they were also under a lot of pressure, right? The government wanted progress, the city wanted speed, and those things, well, they often overshadowed the cautionary voices.
The classic tale. Progress at what cost, right?
It makes you wonder, though, what if they had listened? Would we have a different digital landscape today?
What a tantalizing thought. Speaking of landscapes, let's talk about those transatlantic cables. I mean, those were massive undertakings. The post office and then BT, they were right in the thick of it, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, they were key players. Laying those cables, that wasn't just about engineering. It was about connecting the world in a whole new way.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it. The 1950s, 60s, that wasn't that long ago. And they were already laying the groundwork for a globally connected world. Did they see it that way there? Or was it more about, keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak, competing with other countries?
It was probably a bit of both, to be honest. They knew global communication was the future, and they wanted to be the ones leading the charge. But there was also this competitive element, for sure, especially with the U.S. They were duking it out for dominance in this new world of technology.
A race to connect the world. Literally.
Wow.
And it wasn't just cables, was it? They were messing around with satellites too, right?
Oh, yeah. Early adopters, for sure. They were involved in some of the first satellite projects, like Telstar.
Telstar, as in the first live transatlantic TV signal.
That's the one. 1962, a huge moment. Really captured the public's imagination. Suddenly, beaming information across the globe, it wasn't science fiction anymore. It was becoming reality.
Talk about ambitious. But how did all of this, these global projects, how did they affect what they were doing here in the UK? With their own network, I mean.
It's a bit of a mixed bag, actually. On the one hand, those international projects, they forced them to innovate, right? Develop new technologies, push the boundaries, and some of that, it definitely trickled down to their domestic work.
So a rising tide lifts all boats.
In a way, yeah. But on the other hand, those global projects, they were expensive, time-consuming, and they took focus away from what was happening here at home.
So it was a trade-off. They were trying to conquer the world, but maybe neglecting their own backyard a little.
It's that balancing act again. Global ambitions versus domestic needs. A tale as old as time, right?
And a theme we've seen pop up again and again in this story. Well, we're just about out of time, but this has been an incredible journey. Who knew the history of our internet connections could be so fascinating?
Right. It's not just about wires and cables, is it? It's about people, choices, competing visions for the future.
Exactly. So as we wrap things up, what's the one big takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
I think it's this. The choices we make about technology today, they matter. They really matter. Just like the decisions made by the post office, by BT, by the government, they shaped the digital world we live in now. The choices we make today, they'll shape the future.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not just along for the ride, right? We have a say in how this digital world unfolds.
Absolutely. We have to understand the past, learn from it, and then use that knowledge to create a future that benefits everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
My pleasure. And to everyone listening, remember, keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and keep pushing for a digital future that works for all of us.